Hello and welcome back to the Dragons Are Real lecture series. We're going to move on this week from our last lecture, which was on building the world from the corpse of the dragon and the motifs inherent in there. And we're going to examine in more detail some of that empirical evidence for why dragons might exist, particularly as I have defined them as this archetype of the chaotic and the destructive in the collective unconscious. In terms of where we are, this is our second lecture, so from monkeys to humans, the development of the dragon archetype. Next lecture, your dragons are probably your fault. Lecture 4 will be on how to slay your dragon, and then we'll bring it together with cursed treasure and lasting wounds towards the end of this series. Okay, from monkeys to humans, the development of the dragon archetype. Last time, we talked quite a bit about David E. Jones, and today we're going to explore that in more detail. I hinted at a lot of it, but this time around, we are really going to kind of do a bit of a deep dive on his work in his book, An Instinct for Dragons. We're going to look at some of the criticisms for it, and ultimately conclude whether or not, when Jones says that there are biological and psychological reasons why we have inherited the dragon archetype, what we make of those claims. We're then going to look at archetype creation and the Platonic model, talking about Jung and Plato and a little bit of Feuerbach in there, in terms of how these ideas might solidify, how they might then play out in our lives, how we might gather them in a philosophical, psychological sense, rather than the more evolutionary biology presented by Jones. And ultimately, we're going to finish with looking at how, even if we could trace our belief in dragons back to some arboreal ancestor, how that would be inherited and persist through the generations. The biggest criticism of Jung's work is the lack of biological evidence for the existence of archetypes. There's quite a bit of psychological evidence in terms of patterns of human behavior, but biological evidence there's not a great deal. And we're going to look at two examples that might point to why and where and how the dragon archetype has developed and persisted from. So, An Instinct for Dragons, leading authority or unsubstantiated mess. Critical reception of David E. Jones's work, particularly by people like Daniel Ogden of the University of Exeter, is not very positive on the whole. And considering that Jones was the person whose book really catalyzed for me more than just dragons are an idea, they're pretty cool, they fly about and breathe fire. But actually, you know, this idea that I'm banging on about of considering dragons are real has really powerful psychological force. That idea I am very much tied to, and so Ogden's criticism, while he also writes quite extensively about dragons, really got to me the first time I read it. And as I read it more, I have come to the conclusion, and we'll explore this in more detail as we go on, that Jones's work, at its core, is accurate, although some of his rationale, some of the evidence he relies on is poor. We can support it in other ways. So, African vervet monkeys and their predators. This is an African vervet monkey. Okay, and we have raptors, so eagles specifically in the context of African vervet monkeys, leopards, and they are African rock pythons, are the main predators of the African vervet monkey. And Jones begins his work in Instinct for Dragons talking about African vervet monkeys because they're relatively easy to study. They diverged from human beings about 25 million years ago, which in the span of evolution is not very long. And African vervet monkeys, like many other monkey species, and we'll talk about that in a moment, display very distinctive responses to each of their predators. So when they see an eagle, they will make a call that makes all the other African vervet monkeys look upwards. And the call makes them scan the sky for their predator so that they can avoid it better. They have a different call for the leopard. And the leopard call makes them run to the very ends of the branches where the leopard's weight would cause the branch to snap and so they can be safe. And for normally quadrupedal creatures, the python call makes them take a bipedal stance and scan the ground. And so we have three distinctive predators And we see those traits also play out among the leaf monkeys of Borneo, the pygmy marmosets of the Amazon. They're really common primate traits. The main exception, and Jones points this out, is really interesting actually. The lemurs of Madagascar do not have a responsive call for ophidian predators, so for snakes. And the reason they don't is because when Madagascar split off from the mainland of Africa some 50 million years ago, there were no snakes on the bit of land that is now Madagascar. So they haven't had to fear a snake for 50 million years. And so they have lost, if they ever had, that particular predator response. They still have the leopard and raptor calls, but they don't demonstrate an innate fear of snakes, which makes them rather unique among primates. And Jones says, well, okay, they have these three distinct predators, and those predators seem to share the traits that we would perhaps more commonly associate with a dragon. And he presents this thesis that dragons are an amalgamation in our psyches of raptors, big cats, and snakes. So they fly through the air like raptors. They are generally quadrupedal, and again, there are worms and wyverns and drakes and all different kinds of categorizations that we might make in mythology. But in general, he says they are quadrupedal creatures, and they are ophidian. Okay? And snakes, we talked about last time, being really at the core of what it means to be a dragon, is that association between the dragon and the serpent. And Jones's argument is that, well, evolution selects for what is efficient and what is useful. And he says, well, okay, let's consider that we are the guiding hand of evolution. No, it's a bit too Adam Smith. That we are the viewing this from the standpoint of selecting for efficiency and utility. Is it more efficient and more helpful to have distinctive calls for each of your predator types? Or is it better to be able to respond to novel threats when they arise? Okay? If one day a leopard decides to come to you not from the branches of a tree but across the ground, or if the snake is in the tree rather than on the ground, or if there's a break in the canopy and the raptor comes down and is among you, what do you do in those situations if your specific calls are for different predators? That presents a real problem. And so Jones has this idea, and we'll talk about his substantiation for it in a moment, but he has this idea that over time, those distinctive predator calls were selected out of the primates that evolved larger brains. And that as part of their evolution and their successful advantage, they amalgamated them into a single model of the predator. So their three separate predators were recoded and were coded as predator, and that then allows novel responses to be made to novel problems. It's one of the big things that we try and teach students about today, is how do we prepare students, most importantly, for problems that do not yet exist. It's the biggest problem we face, because we can't know what the problems are. And so you throw a whole bunch of different things at students, and you make them do things that they're not really comfortable with, because you make those who really want to write essays do things like logic, and you make the scientists try and write in more detail, and you make all of them do things like outdoor pursuits, because you're trying to help them develop the ability to respond to novelty. Ability to respond to novelty, evolutionarily helpful for primates, also helpful for students in the world today, and just for humans in general. So, Jones presents this idea that the dragon is this amalgamation, or this meta-predator of primates, because it takes the most terrifying aspects of each of those arboreal predators and uses those to construct this image. To do this, to talk about how that recoding works, he uses George Miller's very famous work on how memory takes chunks of pieces of information and recodes them, because we can't hold lots of pieces of information simultaneously in our brains. And he says, well, okay, if that's what human beings do, right? So if I'm teaching about, I don't know, the nature of the Trinity in Christianity, if I present too many pieces of information at once, it goes right over people's heads. You have to present it in chunks, and those chunks are then recoded into single ideas and more broad ideas. And then you can go through the other way as you go through revision and other things, and you can go from the general idea to the specific things, but they have to be recoded first. He says, well, if that's true for general information for human beings, it can also be true for primates and African vervet monkeys. So in this case, the separate responses to each of the predators, so skyward vigilance or scanning the ground in that bipedal stance or running to the edge of the branches, those things get recoded for a general response of predator, be ready to act. And that predator, be ready to act is more useful than any of the individual responses. Because then if there's a novel predator, you can respond better. And if your predator acts in a way that you don't suspect, because it too is getting craftier in this evolutionary arms race, then you can respond to that as well. It's quite a powerful, straightforward idea that we can recode general sets of predators into a single one. And it's really similar, although importantly different, as I'll talk about in a moment, to my view that the dragon is the archetype of the chaotic and destructive and terrifying being that is capable of great pain and destruction. Okay. We'll talk about the important differences momentarily. So, there are 4 issues I find with Jones's work. The first one is that George Miller's work was focused on short-term memory. He's actually the person that gives us that very famous 7 ± 2 magic number for short-term memory formation. And what he means there is, in your short-term memory as a human being, you can store only, roughly, 7 pieces of information. Any more than 7, you start losing them. And different people have different tolerances for this. So it's 7 ± 2. If you compare my sister and I have a relatively poor working memory. And you can test this, right? If you present a string of numbers and you ask people to remember the string and then to deal with it in their working memory, so repeat it backwards, those kinds of things, the more separate values there are, the harder it is. It's why things like social security numbers and national insurance numbers tend to use pairs of numbers, because a pair of numbers, so 64, is 1 chunk of information. 6 and 4 is 2 chunks of information. And so you can remember longer strings of numbers by chunking them up, but if we take the distinct chunks themselves, 7 ± 2 is about as many as any human being can hold in their head at any one time before they must be recoded or lost. And the problem there is that Jones is taking work on short-term memory and extrapolating it out to long-term memory, even to unconscious forms of memory. It's just the wrong place to get evidence. I'll show you why I think there is sufficient evidence to support the view in general, but his reliance on Miller's work on recoding, I think, is poorly founded. Because while the idea seems to make sense and translate, the fact that it's short-term memory, and most of us do not have at least empirical, don't have at least physical experience of dealing with dragons, that we could have recoded them in our long-term memory. Okay? Some of you may well have been attacked by snakes, raptors, leopards in your life, but very few of you will have been, and so it's unlikely that you've done that from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. And even if your ancestors did, the concept that they would be faced by all 3 predators in the amount of time it would take to have those 3 predators be 3 of the 7 ± 2 chunks of information that then get recoded as a single, it just becomes an idea that has stretched that research too far. And so I think that's a valid criticism of Jones's work. I don't think it's fatal for reasons I'll come on to. The next issue, and this is the one presented by Daniel Ogden in particular, which is that not all dragons are raptor plus cat plus snake. So Fafnir and Vritra, as far as we can work out, are more like worms, W-Y-R-M-S, not W-O-R-M-S. Worms, so they are essentially snakes, right? Essentially snakes. Particularly, as far as we are aware, Fafnir can't fly. Vritra, I don't think, is described as flying. The Satan is also not really ever described as a cat. There is a bit in Genesis 4 that talks about how sin crouched at the door of Cain's mind, and that Cain let it in, and that's why he killed Abel. but that's not generally taken to be a reference to Hasatan as a being, but it is that feline quality. What we see more of in the Bible, and we spoke about this last time, and we'll continue to talk about it, is that the Satan is more associated with the serpent, and later on in the book of Revelation, where that serpent can fly, it might be a winged serpent or a flying serpent. Actually, the next lecture, Your Dragons Are Your Fault, talks a great deal about the nature of the Satan, but it doesn't really fit this raptor plus cat plus snake equation that Jones sets up. Now, while this is a real problem for Jones, given he's looked at these three specific predators and then says that the dragon is an amalgamation of all three, and then we find that that amalgamation actually doesn't play out over time, because, as we saw last time, I have taken a significantly larger and broader view of what a dragon is as this powerful and chaotic and terrifying being capable of bringing great pain and destruction that exists as an archetype in our unconscious. It doesn't matter to me that raptor plus cat plus snake doesn't work, right? That's not what I'm focused on. I'm not taking a biological approach to dragons. I'm taking a psychological one. And so in that context, I don't think this criticism, which is, I think, a really damning criticism of Jones's work, in that even if I am being specific, and we'll talk about in a moment how specific I'm being to the Western or European archetype of the dragon, Jones is taking an even smaller view of that. And I do think that's problematic. On that issue, though, and this has come up in a couple of places recently. So it was on the Pater podcast on dragons that I do recommend. It was also found in my last lecture. I talked about this, and I talked about how there is a distinction between dragons as a description given for beings in the West and in the Far East appear to describe different kinds of beings. And we have this more Far Eastern image of a dragon here. There we go. More Eastern kind of dragon there on the left, which is generally a benign or benevolent or neutral deity to some extent. They aren't really associated with that destruction, that chaos. They are, if anything, more associated with order, although they do often retain the water imagery. Now, it occurred to me as I was listening to that Pater podcast that actually, maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe it's not the case that Eastern dragons are dragons in the same way that Western dragons are dragons. If it's an archetype, and if I'm being very broad about what that archetype might encompass, so going as far as to say that beings like Ymir should be considered as part of this dragon archetype, then actually I'm looking in the wrong place if I limit myself so specifically to looking at dragons as they appear in Chinese folklore. And so I did a bit of research, and it's an area that I will have to explore in more detail. But at the moment, I can tentatively say that a being more like the Nien, this lion-bull amalgamated creature there on the right-hand side, is more like the dragon archetype in the West. Right? If we were to say what in Chinese folklore is a terrifying, destructive, chaotic being capable of bringing great pain and destruction, the Nien fits that pattern far more than the dragon does. Now, the Nien, just very briefly, as I've said, is a lion-bull hybrid. And it is that equivalent to the Chaos Monster. It is associated with the Chinese New Year celebrations, and it emerges once a year from the seas, there's that water image, or the mountains, which might be a bit of raptor association, but either way, it comes from a hidden place. And it wreaks havoc on the populace. It destroys the crops, it kills people, all of the kinds of things we would expect of dragons. Also, more damning, if I'm right about this, it's more damning for Jones, because then we have a dragon that is actually nothing like raptor, cat, snake. Okay? So, when I say that I think what I'm extracting out here is the archetype of the dragon not being the word dragon that we associate with dragons in the Far East, I think this is what I mean. I think we're talking about chaotic, destructive beings more like the Nien than Chinese dragons. Issue 4 is the one that we're going to spend the most time talking about, and it runs into the next section of this lecture on archetypes and the Platonic ideal. Even if such a schema could exist, right? Even if a meta-predator could emerge out of our arboreal ancestors' conflict with their given predators, which, for reasons that I'll aim to demonstrate, I think is true. How on earth could we inherit such an idea over time? So even though we're going to move on and talk about this, this is the biggest criticism that we have of Jung and therefore of work like David E. Jones's work as well. And we're going to spend the rest of this lecture trying to answer it. Because I think we can inherit ideas, and I think we have enough psychological evidence to demonstrate the truth of that, even if the biological evidence is still emerging. And so what we're going to discuss, for me as a pragmatist in my epistemological outview, so I think that we should understand truth as what works and plays out in the world, rather than necessarily understanding truth as a very much objective, empirical, fact-finding mission, where if we don't have evidence that we can test and look for a thing and then experience it with our senses, that it doesn't exist. I don't think that's the right way to think of knowledge. I think empiricism has a great deal to offer, but I just don't think it's a complete picture of truth. And so particularly in this context where I'm talking about dragons, I will take a pragmatist view, and therefore I find the evidence I'm about to present wholly convincing for the existence of dragons. If you are a hardline empiricist, you are unlikely to do so, but I do encourage you to engage with me on that, and perhaps we can have a more expanded discussion. So, archetype creation and the Platonic model. Now, archetypes in the collective unconscious come from the work of Carl Gustav Jung, and many of you will be familiar with some of that work. If you're not, just very briefly, archetypes are archaic symbols or ideas or narratives that exist within the collective unconscious of all human beings and play out over time. And we can't escape playing out those narratives because they're such an ingrained part of our evolutionary structure. Archetypes such as the hero, so Joseph Campbell's very famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, goes into that archetype in particular in much more detail. But the hero, the mother, the shadow, all of these images that we would recognize playing out in stories, and sometimes in literature they end up being called tropes, which I think is very demeaning. Or if it's in the work of Richard Dawkins, you might find it expressed more as ideas, memes, more like mind viruses that take on a mind of their own. I don't think either of those are accurate assessments. I do think Jung is more right than he's wrong in considering them grand narratives that play out over the course of human lives. I won't tell you, because hopefully you can work it out, which of those are the hero, the shadow, and the mother. But it's interesting to see that now with, and a bit of a tangent here on AI art, we can, because of the way that AI art is generative, but by generative we mean it presents a generalized pattern, right? So it's taken all that data, it's broken it down. If we ask something like DALL-E or Midjourney to create an AI piece of image, as I did here for creating images of the archetypes, it can do that to some extent far better than a human being, because what it's doing there is it's taking all of the different references to hero that exist in its data set, which, as good as my brain is far broader than mine would be. And then it constructs out of that an image. And it's really fascinating, and it's something that I'd like to explore in more detail, is that link between using AI art to explore archetypes based on a very large data set that exists within things like Midjourney and DALL-E. Tangent over. So, archetypes for Jung developed through that evolutionary process in actually a very similar way to the way that Jones describes. He is relying in some sense on that Jungian model to say, our ancestors experienced things in the world, they saw these narratives play out, and they abstracted out of those narratives over time the evolutionarily useful lessons, and those lessons become the archetypes, okay? Now, it's a much more expansive idea in the work of Jung, and he talks about the anima and the animus and the shadow and various other things that we won't go into here. But the key takeaway is that there are patterns of behavior and activity that Jung would argue are encoded within each of you, whether you want to believe it or not, and that those patterns, as they play out, are actually part of the grand narrative of human nature and human existence. And I think dragons are part of the grand narrative of human nature. And they're part of the grand narrative of what it is to be a human. I don't think you can exist as a human being fully in the absence of fighting dragons. I think they are a core part of that narrative, and that they're such a core archetype that if you never encountered a dragon in your life, I think you'd be doing something seriously wrong. Plato, the cognitive psychologist. Now, I have taught about Plato for many years, and I hope some of you and some of the viewers will forgive me for the fact that when I teach about Plato, I am not I don't have a doctorate in the works of Plato. I teach about Plato for the purposes of an A-level course. And so I focus specifically on parts of his work, and while I try and read others, it's not really within the scope of my work to become a Plato expert. But as I've taught about Plato's theory of the forms over so many years now, the more I teach about it, and the more I see that in the more empirically minded worldview of my students, the views of Plato just seem to fall flat. I think that I have come to the conclusion that Plato is more of a cognitive psychologist when he's talking about the forms than he is being a philosopher of metaphysics. I'll explain what I mean by that. So, if Plato is making metaphysical truth claims when he says things like, there exists a form of the good, if he's saying, like, there is a separate reality in which the form of the good exists as an entity, and that the form of the good is shining light on all of these other, well, it's not even light, is it? Because light would be in the world of appearances. That he's, shining goodness out, and that goodness is how in the world of forms or the world of ideas you would recognize the other forms. And then in the world of appearances, the sun is the model of the form of the good. And I've spoken about this elsewhere, that we see the sun directly, but also we couldn't see anything else in the world were it not for the light of the sun. Very much a solar idea within the works of Plato. If he's making truth claims in a metaphysical sense, so talking about actual extant realities, I don't think he's right. And maybe that's because I too was brought up in this empirical worldview. But even with my pragmatist hat on, I don't think that's right. But if, instead, I read the works of Plato and I think, well, okay, philosophy was rather undifferentiated back when Plato was writing. If I think that Plato is trying to be a cognitive psychologist, if instead of saying, okay, there exists this separate reality, and we can look at all things we consider good in the world, and we can abstract out of that an idea, and that idea will approximate closest to the form of the good if we do that and dedicate our lives to it. If instead he's saying, actually, that's not talking about an external reality, that's talking about how human beings generate abstract concepts and ideas, and as a pragmatist I would then consider those true, then I think he's onto something. Let's take this as an example. So, on the board are various things that we might consider beautiful. Sonnet 116, that was read at my wedding. We have a beautiful sunrise through a tree. We have my little puppy Beasley. We have the roof, or at least the inside of the roof, of Norwich Cathedral, and a rhododendron. Now, all of those things I consider beautiful. And you might disagree. You'd be wrong, but you might disagree with me. You can all have your own slightly different idea of beauty. But I hope you'll all agree that there is something of your idea of beauty within each of these images. Now, if we say that when Plato talks about the form of beauty, what he's actually doing is saying, okay, look at all the beautiful things you encounter, all the things that fall sort of within an umbrella of what you would consider beautiful from the moment someone ever first told you what the word beauty meant. And you take from all of those things and you abstract out of them and you add them into a general concept of beauty. The form of beauty then exists in your mind, right? And as you expand your knowledge of the world and as you interact with more and more beautiful things, you see in greater depth and you refine your idea of the form of beauty over time. And then when you have children, and my son will be born in just a few weeks now, when you have children, you pass on your idea of beauty to them. And they add to it themselves, and over time they maintain a lot of your conception of beauty. It's rare that people will entirely diverge from an inherited conception of beauty, because to some extent I think, while again we have to be careful, I don't think it's objective beauty, I do think there is a core of truth that runs through everyone's idea of beauty. If what Plato is doing is saying, this model is about how we generate those ideas and how we generate those, and I will ultimately use the word archetypes here, then I think he's perfectly accurate. And what I see as that Platonic model plays out across time, across all of these different people, from Feuerbach in his ideas of a projected religion, where actually God is just the abstraction of human ideals of what the very best human would be. Actually how, although he may well have changed his mind more recently, how Jordan Peterson used to talk about Christ was very much in that Feuerbach projection sense, where you look for, in each quality you would want of the best human being, who is at the top of that hierarchy. And then what is common about all the people at the top of all of those hierarchies. And ultimately you get to an idea of God in a psychological sense. And lecture for an entirely another time, you could say, even if you consider yourself atheist, that God is a psychological reality in the same way dragons are psychological realities. But I'll leave that idea there for now. So, the reason I've gone down this rabbit hole of archetypes and Platonic models is because I think that there is psychological evidence for the dragon archetype playing out over time. And we haven't, and this isn't a lecture in which I will talk about some of those examples that we covered last time. That is for lectures 3 and 4 and 5 and 1. This lecture is really about science and psychology more than it is about the real world. So the whole point here, the Platonic model, the Jungian model, the model presented by Jones, the model presented by Feuerbach, I think they're all the same thing. I think they are all saying that in the world, you observe things, and your ancestors observed things, and both parties have abstracted out of those things fundamental ideas and narratives about the world. And I think dragons are one of those ideas. I think at the core of what he says Jones is right about that concept, that we inherited the idea of the dragon in the same way that we inherited the shadow and the mother and the hero. I think we inherited those ideas from our ancestors who managed to survive and pass on their genetic material. I'll talk about some of the mechanisms for that perhaps in a moment. But I think that's how we act and play out in the world. It's why I think dragons are real. Okay, dragons in the collective unconscious. This section looks at two pieces of what I would consider empirical evidence for dragons existing. We can talk about all the psychological evidence, but ultimately those are ideas, and for empiricists, you can't really test those things. I would say that people act as though dragons exist, and that believing dragons exist and responding to them is a helpful thing, and therefore you may as well consider it true. I'm not that fussed about a lack of empirical evidence for an idea that is clearly valuable and helpful to people in their lives. But if you want it, let's talk about some of this evidence, weak though you may consider it. So, how can concepts be inherited? There's two potential avenues that we could go down here. One is to talk about innate fear. So human beings appear to be born with innate fears of things. And if you can be born with innate fears of things, those must have come from somewhere. And my argument will be that they come from archetypes that exist in your unconscious. The second one is some emerging neuroscientific research that I first learned about on the Human Labs podcast, that looks at some research coming out of Tel Aviv in terms of perhaps there is a pathway for epigenetic inheritance of memory. It's still very nascent, it's still very weak evidence, but it presents what I think will be a more emerging field, and I ultimately hope that Jung will be vindicated. Okay, innate human fears. There is fairly strong evidence that human beings have innate fears of certain things. Spiders, storms, snakes, enclosed spaces. If you look across entire populations, most people find those things scary, at least when they're in proximity to them. And if that was all that we had, you could easily say, well, okay, people experience it and something goes wrong. So the first time that you will go caving, for example, I got a bit big for caving when I was about 16, though I do still enjoy it. But the first time you get stuck when you're caving and you have, thousands of pounds of rock pressing down on you from the top and from the bottom, and you are stuck. And you have to control your breathing to shrink the width of your rib cage so that you can pass through a gap that would otherwise be unpassable. You feel fear. And for some people, that fear and the adrenaline trigger becomes addictive. And for other people, that fear is just fear. And having taken successive generations of students caving in various outdoor pursuits, helping people to overcome that fear very much in the same way as slaying a dragon leaves them with a wonderful feeling of elation. Even if they go through, they get stuck. They are genuinely stuck, even after they have managed to calm down and control their initial response. Even then, if they're stuck, and some people's are, just don't fit through some of these spaces, that's fine. But they gave it a go. They mastered their fear. Okay, so they mastered the dragon that emerged in their mind, and they escaped. And sometimes they escape through, and sometimes they escape backwards. But every single one of them comes out of that feeling proud of their achievement. And they have all done something that lasts with them. Okay. So if you want to go find a dragon, maybe go caving and see what emerges in your psyche when you get stuck. Obviously, disclaimer, with all of the appropriate support and appropriately qualified people and all the rest of it. Now, in terms of actual empirical evidence for these things, Rachman found that a third of British 6-year-olds have an innate fear of snakes, despite never having had an adverse reaction or an adverse experience to one before. And equally, a group of scientists, so Agris, Sylvester, and Olivo, found that 390 out of 1,000 people will exhibit a fear of snakes. And that might not be a full-blown phobia, but a fear of snakes, which puts it as the most common fear among human beings in the sample that they took. Now, there are some issues with this, right? So you find some conflicting evidence that says, well, okay, if you put a group of 2-year-olds in a room with harmless snakes, they play with the snakes like any other toy. They don't exhibit that innate fear you might expect. And there is some research to suggest that. But I think we all have fears that we either consider irrational because we've never had an adverse reaction to them, or we consider silly because actually the harm caused is minimal, right? So as a teacher, one of the worst things that can ever happen in your lesson is that a bee flies into your room. Not even a wasp, a bee, because they're bigger. Now the fact that actually the likelihood of a bee stinging a pupil in a classroom is vanishingly small. And even if it did, it's a bee sting, you'll get over it. The amount of disruption it causes to a lesson, it's a good 15, 20 minutes of your lesson gone, just because there was a bee that came in. Even if those people have never been stung by a bee. They fear being stung so much that they will scream and stand on chairs and run out of a room and cower and hide and demands for kill it, which is, perhaps problematic. It's just a little bee. But these kinds of fears that people have, despite never having had an adverse reaction to things. I was like, well, okay, where do they come from? Well, maybe they come from the archetype of the dragon in the unconscious. Right? Maybe what you see when you see a bee as a relatively young teenager, and you are terrified of its pain or its bite or its sting, whichever of those really helpful zoological terms you want, that what you're actually doing is you're fearing the dragon in part, right? Flying being descends on the enclosed, nice, safe space you're in, potentially causes great harm to you. If you've never been stung by a bee, you will probably estimate that harm higher than if you have been stung by it. Because when you're stung by it, you're like, yeah, that hurts, but it's fine, we get over it. But actually, if you've never been stung, it's a much larger potential pain that can build up in your mind. Maybe bees are dragons, just little dragons, and maybe you should get over your fear of bees first, in trying to counter your fear of dragons. Okay? But in general, we find that some of these innate fears do transcend societal, cultural frameworks, and that therefore they don't appear to be inherited from your society as much as they may well be innate to human beings. Okay? The jury is still out on how strong this evidence is, naturally, because I take this slightly less common approach to how I consider things to be true. I think innate fears are part of this. I think they are part of the dragon archetype. All of these things are potentially chaotic and destructive forces capable of great pain and destruction if left unchecked. Okay? Some of them, not really so capable of bringing great pain and destruction, but that doesn't mean that your brain won't make them out to be so. Now, before I talk about genetic and epigenetic inheritance, I have to make really clear, I am not a biologist. Okay? I will link in the show notes for the digital version of this, the Human Lab podcast where they talk about this in more detail. I will simply present a very rough and ready overview of it now. Ultimately, it is still emerging research. We still don't know the extent of it. I think, ultimately, research like this will vindicate Jung against the kind of critique of empiricism, but we're not there yet. So, Oded Rakavi at Tel Aviv University has done this experiment that seems to demonstrate there is epigenetic mechanism for the inheritance of memory. And then more commonly, we might say, well, okay, can we extrapolate that out to brain structures and archetypes in general? So what they did was they exposed a particular type of worm, C. elegans, this is what it looks like, colorized image. And they exposed the worm to an odor that was not harmful to the worm, while also exposing it to a high temperature that made it uncomfortable and exhibited a stress response but did not kill it. And so what you have is a combination of a neutral stimulus and a harmful stimulus, and the harmful stimulus produces the stress response, and the neutral stimulus really does nothing on its own. And you repeat that until you get to a point where the worms, when exposed to the odor but not the heat, will still exhibit a stress response. Right? It's like Pavlov's dogs. It's exactly the same mechanism. And then what they do is they look to the children or the offspring of that generation of worms that got to a point of exhibiting a stress response in response to the odor. And they take the next generation, the children of those worms, who have never been exposed to the odor in combination with a stressor like the high temperature, and they expose it to the odor. And what happens? The worm exhibits a stress response to something that does not harm it because it did harm its ancestor. Say that again. The children, when exposed to a neutral stimulus, exhibited a stress response because their parents had associated that stimulus with a stressor. And while this is very much emerging research, there is a wonderful opportunity, if this research continues to demonstrate results like this, to say that there is a mechanism, and I won't go into the mRNA coding and the differences in phenotype that are being shown and all the rest of it. It's really not my field, but there is potential scope. That's wonderfully exciting. There is potential scope for empirical evidence that memory can be inherited. And if memory can be inherited, Jung is right. I already think Jung is right, but you'll even convince the empiricists if that evidence over the next series of decades, and it will be decades for it to actually get anything like being able to prove that Jung is right in an empirical sense, even if it all goes the way that we would like it to. But there is a mechanism by which organisms can potentially inherit memory, and that is fascinating. Okay, we're going to bring this to a close, and I want to return to this quote from David E. Jones that you saw in my last lecture. In the end, we find that our psyches are stalked by a fabulous creature whose outlines, etched by evolution and polished by natural selection, remind us that we are still ancient beings possessed of an instinct for dragons. And I think, for all that I have talked about why I think his argument is flawed and where I see problems in it, I think Jones is right. I think dragons do exist as an archetype in the collective unconscious. I think they are psychological realities, and I think that if you treat the things in your life like dragons, if you accept that dragons are real and move forward in your life in that way, I think you will be better off than if you sit there in your dragon denial. And so we'll finish there for today. Next time we will be looking at your dragons being your fault. But until then, I wish you all well. Be a good human. Thank you.